May 13, 1940, the Meuse River, France. Captain Jean-Pierre Moreau was watching an army break every rule he had ever been taught and win. Through his binoculars, the scene made no sense. German soldiers were crossing the river under heavy fire. That part was expected. Men in boats, explosions in the water, bodies drifting in the current. War had a kind of logic to it, even at its worst. But what happened when they reached his side of the river didn't. Small groups of German infantry, 5 men, maybe 8, were moving forward on their own. No officers, no shouted orders, no signals from the rear. And yet they weren't disorganized. They were precise. One group flanked a machine gun nest without hesitation. Another split, moved through a gully, and reappeared exactly where they needed to be. A third adjusted their direction mid-advance, as if they had all received the same command at the same time. Except no command had been given. Moreau lowered his binoculars slowly. He had been an officer for 11 years. He understood how armies worked. Orders came from the top. Decisions flowed downward. That was the system. That was the only way a military could function. What he was seeing wasn't just unusual, it was impossible. He turned to the young lieutenant beside him. Where are their officers? No answer. Who is telling them what to do? Still nothing. Moreau looked back at the river as more German soldiers climbed onto the western bank, each group moving with the same quiet certainty. And that's when the real question hit him. Not where the orders were coming from, but how an army could keep moving forward without them. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll. Type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. The morning had started cold, the kind of damp, gray cold that the Ardennes forest breathes out like a living thing in spring. Fog sat low over the river. The smell of pine and wet stone filled his lungs each time he remembered to breathe. He was crouched behind a limestone outcropping on the western bluff, his binoculars pressed so hard against his eye sockets that they would leave marks he'd notice only days later, if there were days later. He had been told this position was safe. He had been told the Ardennes was impassable for a mechanized force. His generals had told him this. The textbooks at St. Cyr had told him this. The entire logic of the Maginot Line, that brilliant, expensive, immovable monument to French strategic thinking, was built on this assumption. The Germans would come through Belgium. They always came through Belgium. That was where the armies were. That was where the battle would be. So Moreau had expected, at worst, a quiet sector. Perhaps a probe, perhaps a few scouts. What he was watching instead was something that made the back of his neck feel cold in a way that had nothing to do with the morning air. On the eastern bank, German soldiers were crossing the Meuse on rubber assault boats under French artillery fire. This part he understood. This part was terrible, but it was war, and war had logic. Men in boats, shells in the water, some boats flipping, men drowning. That was the expected horror. What didn't make sense was what happened when they reached his side. The French defensive positions on the western bank had broken, not from overwhelming force, not from a coordinated assault that some general had carefully planned and signaled. The positions had broken because small groups of German infantrymen, 5 men here, 8 men there, were making decisions on their own, without stopping, without looking back toward the river for confirmation, without, as far as Moreau could tell, any officer directing them at all. He watched one group of Germans, he counted 7 men, emerge from a gully to his left, assess a French machine gun position, flank it from 2 sides simultaneously, destroy it, and then without pausing for a single breath, continue forward toward the next obstacle. No one had told them to do that. No runner had come from the rear. No radio crackled with orders. They had simply looked at the problem, solved it, and moved. To his right, another group was doing something similar. And further down the bluff, the sound of gunfire suggested more of the same. Moreau lowered his binoculars. He had commanded men for 11 years. He understood military hierarchy. He understood that armies functioned through chains of command, that a private did what his sergeant said, a sergeant did what his lieutenant said, and so the whole organism moved as directed by the minds at the top, who had the maps, who had the picture, who made the decisions. This wasn't that. He turned to his adjutant, a young lieutenant named Fichot, who looked like he hadn't slept in 3 days because he hadn't. "Where are their officers?" Moreau asked. Ficho had no answer. Who was telling them what to do? Ficho stared at him. Moreau looked back at the river. More boats crossing. More small groups materializing on his side of the bank. Each one moving with the same terrifying purposefulness. Each one making choices. Each one acting as though it already knew exactly what to do, even if no one had told it. That shouldn't be possible, Moreau said quietly, to no one in particular. He was right. By every military principle he had ever been taught, by every doctrine and every manual he had read, by the entire accumulated logic of how armies were supposed to work, this shouldn't be happening. But it was. And the question that settled into Captain Jean-Pierre Moreau's chest like a stone dropped into still water. A question that would haunt him through the chaos of the next 6 weeks, through the retreat, through the armistice, through the long, bitter years that followed, was a simple one. How do you kill an army that doesn't need to be told what to do? He wasn't the only one asking. 40 kilometers to the north, a British liaison officer named Major Clifford Reeves was watching German armor pour through a gap in the line near Dinant and reporting to his superiors something that none of them wanted to believe. The German tanks weren't waiting for orders from higher command before exploiting the breakthrough. They were simply going forward, always forward. When a road was blocked, they found another road. When a bridge was blocked, they found another road. When a bridge was blown, they found a ford. When the expected axis of advance was defended, they took a different axis. Not because someone in a chateau 20 kilometers back had radioed new instructions, but because the men in the tanks could see the problem and were already solving it. Reeves wrote in his dispatch that the Germans seemed to operate on a different principle than any army he had studied. He called it, somewhat helplessly, self-direction. His superiors dismissed this as a confused field report from a man under stress. Further south, near the village of Ston, French tank crews who managed to hold their ground for a few hours reported the same phenomenon. German infantry supporting the panzers didn't freeze when their immediate commanders were killed. They reorganized within seconds, the next man stepping into the role, the mission continuing as though the organizational chart had simply updated itself in real time. One French tank commander, a Captain Delot, who would himself become something of a legend that day for the ferocity of his resistance, noted in his account that killing a German officer seemed to produce almost no tactical disruption. The unit just kept coming, in Luxembourg, in the Ardennes, along the Meuse, in Belgium. The same behavior, observed by dozens of Allied officers over those catastrophic days. Something was happening that none of them had a framework to understand. To understand it, we have to go back almost a century. Back to a different war, a different defeat, and a Prussian general who understood something profound about the nature of human decision-making on a battlefield. The year is 1866. A Prussian staff officer named Helmuth von Moltke the Elder is watching his army do something that armies in the 19th century simply did not do. They are winning engagements that their commanders never planned. They are exploiting opportunities that headquarters never authorized. They are moving faster than any enemy can respond to, not because they have better maps or faster horses, but because the men at the front are not waiting for permission. Moltke had spent years thinking about a problem that every commander faces. The battlefield is chaos. Information is incomplete. Plans, as he famously understood, do not survive contact with the enemy. The moment the first shot is fired, everything changes. The terrain is different. The enemy is in a different place. The weather shifts. A bridge that was supposed to be there isn't. And in that moment of change, the army that is waiting for orders from above is an army that has already lost precious seconds, precious minutes, sometimes precious hours. The traditional solution was better communication, faster riders, better signals, more detailed orders. But Moltke understood that this was attacking the wrong problem. You could never make communication fast enough to match the speed of events on the ground. The person who was there could always see faster than any message could travel. So his answer was radical. Stop trying to tell soldiers what to do. Instead, tell them what you are trying to achieve. Give them the objective. Trust them with the why. And then let them find their own how. This philosophy, developed across decades and hammered into the Prussian and then German officer corps, came to be called Auftragstaktik. In English, it is sometimes translated as mission tactics or directive-based command, but both translations miss something. Auftrag means mission, yes, but it carries a weight of trust and delegated authority that mission in English doesn't quite convey. The idea was that orders should tell a commander what outcome was needed and why, and nothing more. The how was the commander's problem to solve. And crucially, if the commander was killed, the next man in line already understood the purpose well enough to continue without missing a step. Moltke didn't just talk about this, he institutionalized it. He built it into training. He built it into promotion criteria. He built it into the culture of the German military at every level, from the general planning the campaign to the sergeant leading a squad across a river. Every man was trained to ask not, "What am I told to do?" but, "What is the situation, what is the goal, and what is the best thing I can do right now to advance that goal?" This was the system that Captain Moreau, watching the Meuse crossing in 1940, had no framework to understand. It had been building for 70 years. The man who perhaps embodied Ostrogstadt most completely in the Second World War was a general who had by 1940 only recently been given command of a panzer division and who had spent most of his career as an infantry officer. His name was Erwin Rommel. On the night of May 12th and into the 13th, Rommel's 7th Panzer Division was supposed to cross the Meuse at Dinant. The crossing was planned, organized, scheduled. It was also falling apart. The first attempts had been driven back by French fire. The assault boats were taking casualties. The men on the riverbank were pinned and shaken. A different commander might have gone back to his command post, assessed the situation, consulted the plan, requested artillery support, sent messages up and down the chain, and waited for everything to be ready before trying again. This was, in a sense, the rational thing to do, the organized thing. Rommel crossed the river himself. He didn't do it to prove courage, though courage was clearly not something he was short of. He did it because he understood instinctively what Moltke had codified decades earlier, that leadership is not a function of position in the organizational chart. It is a function of who is closest to the problem. If he was on the riverbank, he could see what his men could see, decide what they could decide, and move at the speed that the situation demanded. He wasn't going to command the crossing from a map table. He was going to be in it. He crossed under fire. He organized the crossing from the western bank. He made decisions in real time that no amount of planning could have anticipated. And his men, trained in the same system, understood what he was doing and why, and they moved with him. By morning, the crossing had succeeded. The breakthrough that would hollow out the entire Allied position in France had begun. But here is the thing that matters most about Rommel at the Meuse, the thing that often gets lost in accounts of his personal bravery. When he crossed the river and moved forward, he lost contact with his division headquarters for hours. His staff didn't know exactly where he was. His units couldn't always reach him directly. By the organizational logic of almost any other army in the world, this should have caused paralysis. A division whose commander has gone forward and can't be reached is a division that has to stop and wait. The 7th Panzer Division did not stop, because every battalion commander, every company commander, every sergeant in that division had been trained to know the mission, to understand the objective, to make the call that the situation required, without waiting for the call to come from above. Rommel's absence didn't create a vacuum. The system filled it automatically. Now look at the same period through the lens of the French army, and a pattern emerges that is almost heartbreaking in its clarity. The French military in 1940 was not a bad army. Let that be stated plainly, because the mythology of the fall of France has sometimes obscured this. The French had more tanks than the Germans in the West. Their artillery was respected. Their soldiers were brave. Their fortifications were extraordinary. On pure numbers and equipment, the matchup was not as lopsided as the result suggests. What the French army had was a command philosophy built on a precise opposite of Ostrogstadt. It was called, in its theory, methodical battle. In practice, it meant that action at any level required authorization from above. A company commander who identified an opportunity was expected to report it up the chain and wait for instructions. A battalion that took an unexpected position was expected to consolidate and hold rather than exploit until orders came down telling them what to do next. This worked beautifully in controlled conditions. In set-piece battle, where everything moved according to plan, it produced disciplined, coordinated action. The French army had been built to fight the war they remembered from 1914 to 1918, a war of fixed lines and careful coordination and deliberate advances. But the war the Germans were fighting in 1940 did not stop and wait for orders. The critical moment, The moment that represents the entire campaign in miniature came on May 15th, when the German breakthrough at Sedan had created a gap in the Allied line. It was a gap that a determined counterattack could potentially have closed. General Charles de Gaulle, commanding the 4th Armored Division, would later attack Erlaun with exactly this kind of aggressive intent, and his assault would briefly alarm German headquarters. But for 2 crucial days before de Gaulle's attack, the Allied command structure was in a state that can only be described as institutionalized paralysis. The information about the breakthrough traveled up the French chain of command slowly, was processed slowly, was debated at the highest levels, was referred to the British, required political consultation, needed approval before action could be ordered. By the time authorizations came back down through the layers, the German spearheads had already moved so far forward that the gap could no longer be closed. The French weren't slow because their generals were stupid. General Gamelin was a sophisticated man. General Georges was experienced. They were slow because their entire system was built on the assumption that time was available for authorization. The Germans had removed that assumption from the battlefield. And lower down, the damage was even more personal. There are accounts from the mass crossing of French soldiers in well-prepared positions, with ammunition, with cover, with everything they needed to defend, who stopped fighting not because they were overwhelmed, but because their officers had been killed and no one remaining knew what to do next. Not because they were cowards, because they had never been trained to decide. They had been trained to execute decisions made by others. When the decision maker was gone, the mechanism stopped. This is not a comfortable thing to say about brave men, but it is the truth that the record shows. The same contrast repeated itself with devastating consistency in North Africa. Rommel arrived in Libya in February 1941 with 2 divisions and instructions to hold a defensive line. His superiors in Berlin and Rome told him explicitly not to advance. The situation was not ready for advance. He did not have sufficient logistics for advance. He was to hold. He advanced on March 31st. Within 2 weeks, he had driven the British across most of Cyrenaica, retaken territory that the British had captured over months of fighting, and surrounded the port of Tobruk. He did this with a force that was formally inadequate for the task, through a combination of personal audacity and a command philosophy that allowed his subordinates to maintain momentum even when they couldn't reach him, which was often because Rommel was frequently forward with the leading elements, seeing the battlefield with his own eyes, making decisions at the speed of events. The British forces opposing him were commanded by men who were individually capable and in some cases brilliant, but they were operating within a system that required confirmation, that required information to travel up and decisions to travel back down, that required the men at the front to wait while the men at the rear processed. General Wavell, the British commander, flew to the front on April 2nd to assess the situation and found it incomprehensible. His troops were retreating, but there seemed to be no single cause, no overwhelming German force that he could identify as the reason. There were Germans everywhere, in unexpected places, doing unexpected things without apparent pause. He wired London that the situation was serious. The situation was serious because the gap between how fast the Germans could act and how fast the British could respond had become unbridgeable, not in armor, not in numbers, in tempo, in the speed of decision. General O'Connor, one of Britain's best tactical commanders, was captured during the chaos of the retreat. Not in battle, but when his car took a wrong turn in the dark and drove into a German patrol. He would spend years as a prisoner of war, robbed from his side at the moment when his decisiveness was most needed. Rommel, meanwhile, was sleeping in the desert, in his staff car, moving before dawn each day to be at the point of decision before his enemies had finished their morning briefings. And then there is the story that most clearly illustrates what Aftershocked could do when taken to its logical extreme. May 10, 1940. The Belgian fortress of Eben Emael. Eben Emael was considered by many analysts to be the most powerful fortress in the world. It sat at the junction of the Albert Canal and the Meuse River, its guns commanding the approaches that any German advance through Belgium would have to use. It had massive artillery, thick concrete, a garrison of over 1,200 men, and had been built specifically to stop exactly the kind of attack that the Germans were planning. The Belgian military estimated it could hold against any assault for days, possibly weeks. It fell in less than 24 hours. It was captured by 78 men. The assault on Eben Emael was carried out by a German glider unit, Sturmgruppe Garnet, under the command of a lieutenant named Rudolf Witzig. The plan was innovative. land on top of the fortress itself, destroy the gun emplacements with hollow charge explosives, neutralize the garrison from within. It was an extraordinary idea, and it required extraordinary execution. On the morning of the assault, Lieutenant Witzig's glider broke free from its tow rope over Germany and landed in a field. He was not there. His second-in-command, a non-commissioned officer, a sergeant named Helmut Wenzel, landed on top of the fortress with the rest of the unit and proceeded to carry out the mission anyway, without the officer, without new orders, without radio contact with higher command. Wenzel knew the objective. His men knew the objective. They had trained for this mission for months. Every man understood not just what he was supposed to do, but why, and what the larger operation required. So when the officer was absent, nothing stuck. The mission continued. The hollow charges were placed. The gun emplacements were destroyed one by one. The garrison was neutralized. Witzig eventually organized another tow aircraft, flew to the fortress, and arrived to find his men had been fighting for hours and were in control of the situation. He resumed command of an operation that had never actually stopped. The fortress that was supposed to hold for days had been effectively neutralized before noon. 187 kilometers of Belgian defensive line were now exposed. The invasion of France could proceed, by a sergeant who understood that the mission mattered more than the hierarchy. The pattern, once you see it, becomes impossible to unsee. It is not one battle, it is not one general. It is not a lucky accident of timing or terrain or weather. Across the fall of France, across North Africa, across the early campaigns in Russia, wherever the German military met opponents who were well-equipped and well-trained, but who relied on command from above, the same thing happened. The Germans moved faster. They responded faster. They recovered from setbacks faster. They exploited opportunities faster. Not always by a lot, sometimes by just minutes. But in war, minutes are everything. The Soviets in 1941 had more tanks than the Germans, more artillery, more aircraft, more men. They had been fighting hard in Spain and Finland and had learned lessons. They had officers who were brave and in some cases brilliant. But Stalin's purges of the late 1930s had hollowed out precisely the thing that Auftragstactik required: the culture of independent judgment in commanders. Officers who showed initiative risked being seen as unreliable, potentially disloyal. The safe behavior was to wait for orders, to not exceed authorization, to not make a decision that had not been sanctioned from above. When German Army Group Center crashed into the Soviet Western Front in June 1941 and shattered the command structure, when communications were cut, when headquarters were overrun, when generals were killed and units were surrounded, the result was catastrophic, not just tactically but psychologically. Soviet units that still had their weapons and their men in their position could not act coherently because the decision-making had always lived somewhere else. In a headquarters, in a chain, in a system that had just been severed. German units in similar situations, surrounded, cut off, out of communication, reorganized and fought their way out, because the capacity to decide lived in every man at every level. This was not an accident. It was a culture, deliberately built, deliberately trained, deliberately sustained across generations of military thinking that went all the way back to Moltke, standing on a battlefield in 1866 and understanding something true about the nature of war. May 13, 1940, the western bank of the Meuse, late afternoon. Captain Jean-Pierre Moreau is no longer watching from his limestone outcropping. The position has become untenable. He is retreating through the forest with a group of perhaps 20 men, moving west, and as he moves, he has time, the terrible, unwanted gift of defeat, to think. He has watched, in the course of this single day, French defensive positions that were well constructed and well supplied collapse, not because of numbers, not because of firepower, but because of something that felt almost like a force of nature. The Germans moved like water. They found the gaps, the angles, the moments between moments. When one avenue closed, they were already taking another. When a man fell, the man behind him stepped forward without hesitation, and the direction of movement didn't change. He remembers a conversation he had at St. Cyr, years ago, with an instructor who had studied the German army of the previous century. The instructor had tried to explain Auftragstactik, and Moreau had listened politely and not entirely understood why it mattered. It seemed like a philosophical nicety. Armies needed order. Armies needed hierarchy. Armies needed command. Walking through the Ardennes forest with German artillery beginning to sound behind him, he understands what he didn't understand then. The question he asked that morning, who's telling them what to do, was the wrong question. Or rather, it was the right question with the wrong assumption built into it. He had assumed the answer had to be a person, a general, an officer, a commander. He had assumed that without a visible, identifiable leader directing each action, the action couldn't happen. The Germans had answered his question before he asked it. No one needed to tell them what to do, because they all already knew. Not the specific orders, not the detailed movements, but the purpose, the objective, the reason they were crossing this river on this morning at this moment. And from that shared understanding, everything else followed. The flanking maneuver, the exploitation of the gap, the continuation after the officer fell. It all flowed from a simple, deep, profoundly radical trust. Trust that the man beside you and below you in the hierarchy understood the mission well enough to make the right decision without being told. The advantage wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a strategy. It was a belief about human beings, the belief that ordinary men, given purpose and understanding rather than mere instructions, would rise to the moment, and they had. There is a final thing to say about all of this, and it requires stepping back from the battles and the tactics and the brilliant or failed decisions and looking at the human cost. The men who fought in these campaigns, French soldiers on the Meuse, British tankers in the Libyan desert, Soviet infantrymen in the forests of Byelorussia, were not inferior. They were not lacking in courage. Many of them died with extraordinary bravery in positions that the systems they served had made indefensible. General de Gaulle, who would one day speak for an entire civilization's will to resist, identified the problem clearly and fought against it and was largely ignored until everything had already broken. Lieutenant General O'Connor, captured in the dark outside Derna, was one of the most tactically gifted officers Britain had in Africa, and his loss was a tragedy that his side could not afford. The Soviet soldiers who stood and died in the pockets of 1941 did so with a ferocity that eventually, over years of suffering beyond description, produced a military culture that learned something close to the lesson and eventually turned the tide. And on the German side, the men who embodied Auftragtaktik most fully, the young sergeants and lieutenants who led from the front, who made the call without waiting, who stepped forward when the officer ahead of them fell, died in astonishing numbers. The Eastern Front consumed them. The logic that made the German military so effective in movement also made it brutal in attrition. You can only replace initiative with initiative when the men who carry it survive long enough to pass it on. Sergeant Wenzel, who led the assault on Ibn Emil when his officer didn't arrive, survived the war. He lived to old age, but many of the men who stormed that fortress with him did not. The idea outlasted all of them. Auftragtaktik, stripped of the specific context of the war that made it infamous, is now the foundation of military doctrine in most of the world's professional armies. The United States military studied the German campaigns with obsessive care in the decades after World War II, and what emerged was a concept called mission command, the explicit doctrine that orders should communicate intent and objective, that subordinates should have the authority and the expectation to act on their own judgment, that the capacity to decide should be distributed rather than concentrated. NATO codified it. The Israeli Defense Forces built an entire military culture around a version of it. The lesson of the Meuse crossing, of the fall of Ibn Emil, of Rommel's advance across Cyrenaica, was not lost. It was simply paid for first, in a currency of suffering so vast that the numbers still resist imagination. Moreau reached the French lines before nightfall on May 13th. He would fight again in the weeks that followed, retreat again, and eventually cross to England to continue the war. He spent the rest of it training soldiers, which, if this fictional life has any meaning, seems right. What he carried with him, the thing that settled into his chest on that morning by the river and never quite left, was not shame. It was understanding. The hardest kind of understanding, the kind that arrives after it's too late to use. The Germans weren't better men. They weren't superhuman. They hadn't discovered some secret of war that no one else could have found. They had simply understood, earlier and more completely than anyone else, that in the chaos of battle, you cannot control from above what you have not already embedded from within. The question is never, in the end, whether your orders are good enough. The question is whether your people understand well enough to act without them. No one was in command, and that was the point. That was always the point.